And so imagine, it's 1943, you've got an aircraft engine factory in East Hartford, and they expand their workforce by roughly 1,000%, basically overnight.
Right, which is just an astronomical scale up.
Exactly. And they fill the floor with highly volatile materials, explosive solvents, and literally tens of thousands of workers who had never even set foot in heavy industry before.
It's a recipe for disaster.
Total disaster. I mean, they were tasked with building some of the most complex, tightly calibrated machines on the planet. By all conventional logic, the place should have just burned to the ground in a week.
Oh, absolutely.
But it didn't. And today, we are taking a deep dive into the invisible safety net that kept the American war machine from just, collapsing under its own weight during World War II.
Yeah, we're focusing on a state that functioned as the quiet backbone of victory, which is Connecticut. And we're doing this by examining two deeply interconnected systems based on some really fascinating historical thesis papers we've got.
Right.
On one side, you have the physical manufacturing that was pushing the absolutely technical limits of the era. And then on the other side, you have the Hartford insurance industry, which was absorbing and governing the catastrophic risks that came with pushing those limits.
Okay, let's unpack this. If the big factories in other states were the brute muscle of the war effort, Connecticut was the central nervous system. My focus today is going to be on the thrilling, tangible hardware. The hyper-precise industrial output like submarines and aircraft engines.
Which is the flashy stuff for sure.
It is, but the other half of this equation is something completely counterintuitive, which is your focus. The invisible infrastructure.
Right.
The actuaries and safety engineers who manage the terrifying risks of producing all that hardware.
Yeah, and if we connect this to the bigger picture, victory didn't just depend on making weapons. It depended on preventing the system from collapsing under its own weight. And that's exactly what Connecticut did.
And for you listening right now, I promise that by the end of this deep dive, you will completely rethink how complex, catastrophic risks are managed. Whether that's in a 1940s submarine shipyard or honestly in your own modern workplace.
It's incredibly relevant today. But to understand how they managed that wartime risk, we really have to look at the pre-war foundation.
Okay, set the stage for us.
So Connecticut already possessed this incredibly dense concentration of precision manufacturing long before the war started. This wasn't a culture built on mass-producing bulk commodities.
Right.
We're talking about firms like Colt, Winchester, Pratt & Whitney, and Electric Boat. These places were defined by tight tolerances, microscopic quality control, and just exact repeatability.
Which is a massive distinction, right? I mean, volume manufacturing versus precision manufacturing. Pumping out millions of generic steel screws or stamping out Jeep chassis is one thing.
Right, because if a few of those units fail, it's an accepted margin of error.
Exactly. A Jeep breaks down, you pull it over to the side of the road and fix it. But Connecticut specialized in systems where failure carried immediate catastrophic consequences. I mean, if an aircraft engine fails over the Pacific Ocean, 10 men die.
Yeah.
If a submarine hull breaches at 400 feet, the entire crew is lost.
And that specialization is exactly what allowed a relatively small state to punch significantly above its weight class. I mean, Connecticut produced about 4% of all U.S. armaments.
Which is crazy for its size.
It is. They ranked in the top 10 states for wartime manufacturing output. And they achieved those numbers by aggressively targeting what we call strategic bottleneck technologies.
Bottlenecks, meaning the stuff everyone else relies on.
Exactly. They built the core components that the rest of the war machine fundamentally needed to function.
And aircraft engines are like the ultimate example of a strategic bottleneck.
Oh, without a doubt.
Because without an engine, an airframe being built in some massive plant in California is just a very expensive, shiny metal tube sitting uselessly on a runway.
Just a glider, basically.
Right. And Pratt & Whitney, headquartered right there in East Hartford, completely dominated this space. Before the war, they employed a few thousand specialized workers. But at peak wartime production, they had expanded to approximately 40,000 workers.
That scale-up is just staggering.
It's wild. By the end of the conflict, they had produced over 300,000 aircraft engines.
And by 1943, those Pratt & Whitney engines were powering the overwhelming majority of U.S. military transport aircraft. We are talking about the core capability to execute strategic bombing campaigns, move troops across continents, and just maintain Allied air mobility in general.
So the logistical implications of that single company's output shaped the entire Allied strategy in the air.
Absolutely.
But they weren't just dominating the skies, they were executing the exact same strategy of hyper-precision underwater. I mean, Electric Boat and Groton built 74 submarines during the war.
74.
Yeah, and when you look at submarine production in this era, you are looking at the most complex mechanical systems on the planet.
Oh, yeah. It's essentially a spaceship for the ocean.
That's a great way to put it. You're integrating diesel propulsion, battery banks, advanced navigation, torpedo targeting systems, and life support into a single pressurized tube. And it has to operate flawlessly in a hostile environment thousands of miles from a friendly port.
And the operational role of those 74 submarines was strategically decisive.
How so?
Well, they were the primary instrument for disrupting and strangling Axis supply lines, particularly in the Pacific theater. They cut off the flow of oil, rubber, and reinforcements to the Japanese home islands,
Right.
which fundamentally crippled Japan's ability to sustain a protracted conflict.
And all of this is happening while other companies in the state are churning out hundreds of thousands of highly reliable, standardized small arms from Colt and Winchester.
Right, the small arms too.
And they were even pioneering completely new emerging technologies. Like Sikorsky, located in Stratford, they produced the R-4, which was the world's first mass-produced military helicopter.
Which is just a massive leap in vertical lift capability. It set the stage for modern aviation rescue operations.
It's an unparalleled portfolio of engineering. But making millions of generic screws is one thing. Building a submarine that must operate flawlessly underwater is like performing heart surgery on an assembly line.
That's a very accurate comparison.
But here's my question. Scaling up from a few thousand workers to 40,000 workers overnight, doesn't that inherently destroy quality control and invite disaster?
Yes, absolutely. And that exact threat of disaster was the existential danger of the war economy.
Because you're bringing in tens of thousands of untrained workers,
Right.
women entering the industrial workforce for the first time, people from completely different trades, and you're asking them to handle highly explosive materials and machine complex parts to fractions of a millimeter.
It's a terrifying structural vulnerability. Quality control isn't just going to slip in that scenario. The factories are going to blow up. Literally, you are introducing massive systemic vulnerabilities. Industrial fires, sabotage, transportation losses, and catastrophic workforce injuries. A single massive fire at a bottleneck facility like Pratt & Whitney would literally alter the timeline of the war.
Because if the engine supply stops, the bombers stop flying.
Exactly. Industrial accidents had evolved from localized tragedies into national-level strategic threats. To survive that high wire act, Connecticut had to deploy a safety net. Which brings us to the insurance sector.
Which brings us to the core mystery here for me. Because if the risks of scaling hyperprecision were that extreme, why didn't the entire Connecticut industrial base just spontaneously combust?
Right.
There had to be some kind of institutional brake pedal keeping the whole thing from flying off the rails.
And that brake pedal was the Hartford insurance industry. Firms like Aetna and the Travelers, they functioned as active institutional partners to the manufacturers, not just passive financial services.
Wait. So when we talk about underwriting here, we aren't talking about clerks pushing papers and waiting for a claim to be filed after a fender bender.
Not at all. Hartford was already established as the insurance capital of the world, but during the war, these companies transformed into proactive architects of industrial safety.
Wow.
These actuaries, the math experts calculating the exact probability of catastrophic failure, they were essentially the ultimate reality check on the government's production goals.
Okay, that makes sense. Because put yourself in the shoes of a factory owner in 1941.
Right.
The federal government is demanding you multiply your output by 10. You have to build new facilities, pack them with volatile chemicals, and hire thousands of untested workers.
It's terrifying from a business perspective.
The threat of a single catastrophic explosion bankrupting your entire operation is paralyzing. No rational business owner makes that investment if one spark ruins them forever.
Exactly. And the private insurers in Hartford stepped in to absorb that catastrophic extreme risk. They provided the financial guarantee that allowed the factories to operate without fear of a single catastrophe bankrupting them.
But they couldn't just blindly write a policy for an explosives factory staffed by rookies and hope to the best.
No, that's a guaranteed path to bankruptcy for the insurance company.
Right. They had to aggressively mitigate the risk they were taking on, which brings us to the physical mechanism of this governance, right? The safety engineers.
Yes, insurers didn't just pay out claims. They deployed armies of specialized safety engineers directly onto the factory floors.
Wow.
And they didn't just observe. They mandated hazard mitigation. They enforced strict loss prevention practices as a non-negotiable condition of coverage.
So if a factory refused to implement the safety protocols dictated by the actuaries, what happened?
The insurer pulled their coverage. And without coverage, the factory couldn't legally operate.
So instead of waiting for a disaster to strike, these inspectors were preemptively redesigning the assembly lines.
Exactly. An actuary would look at a floor plan, see a stockpile of highly volatile aeronautical solvents sitting like 50 feet from an arc welding station, and immediately mandate a firewall be built.
They were actively altering the floor plan?
Actively altering it, yeah. They dictated ventilation standards to prevent toxic fumes from incapacitating the workforce. They were physically altering the layout of American industry.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Are you telling me that actuaries and safety inspectors were essentially dictating wartime production strategy?
Essentially, yes.
It's like having a high-performance race car, but realizing the pit crew and the brakes are the only reasons it can cross the finish line.
That's a perfect analogy. What's fascinating here is insurance transformed catastrophic uncertainty into manageable loss. They didn't just indemnify, they altered industrial behavior to keep the lines moving.
The precision engineers built a massive roaring engine, but the actuaries designed the brakes that allowed the government to push that engine to its absolute limits safely.
And without those brakes, the federal government couldn't have managed the extraordinary risks of actual combat operations either.
Wait, what do you mean? Like beyond the factories?
Yeah. The model developed in Hartford was so effective that Washington leaned on it heavily for hazards that were too massive even for private insurers to handle alone, for extreme combat zone risks like maritime and aviation losses.
Oh, because a private insurance company cannot independently underwrite a cargo ship that is actively being hunted by German U-boats in the Atlantic.
Right. The math simply doesn't work when the destruction is intentional and highly probable.
So how did they handle that?
The federal government had to step in as the ultimate financial backstop. They formed these hybrid war risk programs. The government held the purse strings for the catastrophic losses, but they relied entirely on the private Hartford insurers to manage the complex administration.
So the private insurers handled the specialized underwriting processes and the logistical coordination.
Exactly. Because the federal agencies didn't have the institutional memory, the specialized workforce, or the mathematical models to process that level of risk assessment on a global scale.
Right, Hartford already had the infrastructure in place.
They were the undisputed experts in the mechanics of risk. So the government effectively outsourced the administration of wartime survival to them.
Okay, so we have this profound synergy. Hyper-precision engineering on one side and active risk governance on the other.
Yes.
But how can we definitively prove that this specific combination was so vital? I mean, history's complicated.
It is. But the best way to prove the value of a system is to see what happens when you remove it entirely. We need to look at the second thesis document and conduct a counterfactual analysis.
A counterfactual, okay.
Right.
So what happens if we imagine a World War II where Connecticut simply doesn't participate?
Right, let's erase Connecticut from the map in 1941.
Now, to be fair, there is a valid counter-argument here. If you hypothetically remove Connecticut entirely from the timeline, the United States still possesses the sheer industrial might of the Midwest and the West Coast.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, Ford, General Motors, and Kaiser Steel could theoretically just figure out how to build complex submarine parts and aircraft engines. The sheer volume of American steel and natural resources feels like it would eventually overwhelm any gap left by one state. The United States likely still wins the war.
Yes, the ultimate outcome probably doesn't change. The sheer national scale was too massive. But the trajectory of the war changes drastically.
How so?
The conflict becomes longer, significantly more costly, and far more operationally fragile. Let's map the cascading failures of that domino effect, starting with the industrial bottlenecks.
Okay.
If Pratt & Whitney vanishes, the demand for those hundreds of thousands of aircraft engines shifts to other firms, like Curtiss-Wright.
But Curtiss-Wright is already operating near maximum capacity. You can't just snap your fingers and magically double the floor space of an engine factory.
No, you can't. They would need completely new tooling. They have to train a massive new workforce in hyper-precise machining from scratch.
And design and implement entirely new quality control systems.
Exactly. And those friction points introduce severe delays. We aren't talking weeks, we're talking months or even years.
And as a result, transport aircraft availability plummets.
Yes, global logistics chains freeze, troop movements stall, strategic airlift reliability is fundamentally compromised during the most critical early phases of the conflict.
So the entire Allied supply chain in the air starts to choke.
Exactly.
And the exact same cascading failure happens in the ocean if you erase electric boat. The Navy has to shift the construction of those 74 submarines to other, less experienced shipyards around the country.
And those alternate shipyards lack the established institutional experience in high-volume, high-complexity submarine production. The learning curve for integrating propulsion and life support in a pressurized hull is incredibly steep.
So the early war submarine shortages, which were already a critical problem for the U.S. Navy in 1942, those would have persisted much longer.
They would have. And if you don't have a robust fleet of submarines prowling the waters off the coast of Japan in 1943, Japan gets to keep importing oil and rubber.
They keep building Zeros. They keep reinforcing their island garrisons.
Exactly. You lose the ability to interdict access supply lines early on. You are actively delaying the strangulation of the enemy's logistics, which prolongs every single naval campaign in the Pacific theater.
And we haven't even touched on the precision manufacturing gaps in small arms yet.
Right.
Because without Colt and Winchester, the production of standardized, highly reliable weaponry shifts to less specialized facilities, which guarantees higher defect rates.
And in a combat zone, a defect in your rifle isn't an inconvenience, it is fatal.
A lack of standardization also means that maintenance and repair become a logistical nightmare in the field. Parts aren't interchangeable anymore.
And you'd also lose the early operational innovation of Sikorsky's helicopter, delaying vertical lift developmental learning and setting back post-war aviation progress by years.
So the hardware bottleneck is severe. But the other side of the counterfactual, the insurance side, is perhaps the most dangerous.
Oh, without a doubt. What happens to the American war machine if the Hartford insurance industry isn't there to govern the systemic risk?
Right, because without Hartford's concentrated underwriting expertise and active safety engineering, factories across the entire country face massive, uninsured risk exposure.
Instead of being protected by that invisible safety net, a single catastrophic fire at a crucial specialized supplier doesn't just halt their production for a week.
It bankrupts the company entirely.
Yes, and that bankruptcy triggers cascading failures down the entire national supply chain.
Oh, man. So if the specific factory making specialized valves in Ohio burns down and goes out of business, the factory making the aircraft engines in Michigan stops production?
And if the engine factory stops, the airplane assembly plant in California stops. It's a systemic insurance collapse.
And without the Hartford safety engineers embedding on the factory floors, dictating firewalls and ventilation, accident rates skyrocket.
Millions of untrained workers trying to build explosives and heavy machinery without strict actuary-mandated safety protocols leads to chaos.
Downtime increases drastically.
Production reliability crashes across the board. The federal government would eventually be forced to step in to stop the bleeding.
But without Hartford's administrative capacity and mathematical models, federal agencies would be completely overwhelmed by the sheer complexity of managing all this risk.
You would likely see emergency government takeovers of critical industries just to keep them running, which introduces massive bureaucratic inefficiency.
So what does this all mean? If we had the sheer industrial might of the rest of the country, wouldn't American factories just figure it out and adapt?
This raises an important question for you, the listener, about how we view efficiency. Yes, they would adapt eventually, but in a total war, you don't have eventually. Time is paid for in blood.
You cannot mandate a culture of precision overnight, and you cannot instantly replicate the deep institutional memory required for actuarial science.
Exactly. The delay itself is the ultimate cost. Every month spent trying to relearn what the machinists and actuaries in Connecticut already knew was a month of sustained global combat, measured in lost lives, lost time, and lost production.
Time is paid for in blood. That crystallizes the cost of absence perfectly. It proves that Connecticut's absence wouldn't have caused an immediate national defeat, but it would have violently eroded the resilience of the entire mobilization effort.
The visible output of the war, the tanks rolling off the line, the submarines sliding into the ocean, is just the final visible result of a massive hidden process of risk management and precision discipline.
It really is. And for you listening, Connecticut's dual role perfectly illustrates that modern conflicts, and truly modern civilization as a whole, are sustained by so much more than just visible output.
It's about the systems behind the scenes.
Exactly. It's about the invisible infrastructures of continuity, the safety feedback loops, the risk governance that absorbs the shocks of reality so the system doesn't buckle under its own weight. It is about prioritizing survivability over spectacle.
And that principle extends far beyond the historical context of the 1940s. Today, we are surrounded by our own highly complex, invisible infrastructures.
Like what?
Well, think about the intricate digital supply chains that keep global logistics moving and grocery store shelves stocked. Think about the cybersecurity underwriters who mandate digital firewalls to ensure a single ransomware attack doesn't bankrupt a regional hospital system.
Wow.
Yeah. Think about the safety protocols deeply embedded in the coding of every piece of automated technology you interact with. Based on what we just learned about Connecticut in the 1940s, ask yourself, what is the quiet backbone keeping your industry from collapsing today? And what would happen if it suddenly disappeared tomorrow?
Suddenly, the massive visible muscle of our modern world doesn't seem quite as invincible without the invisible nervous system telling it how to survive. Definitely something to think about the next time you assume the visible output is the only thing doing the heavy lifting.